There we go. So I see the participants are filing in here. We're up at 38. We'll just give it a few more minutes to make sure we've got the whole group. Hello there. I see we've got a few notes here. We've got a note from Jenna asking whether she's supposed to have video enabled or not. And this is a webinar format. So we'll just have the speakers with video on for this evening to limit the pressure on broadband for everyone. It's going to be a large meeting this evening. Welcome. Hi, Catherine. Hi, Sam. Hi, Cynthia. It's great to see you all coming in. And we will have an opportunity for questions at least 2 points in time this evening. So you will see at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A option with the little voice bubbles. And there you can put in your questions, and you're also welcome to participate in the chat over the course of the talk this evening. So. Wonderful. I'll just give it one more minute and then I'll start with some introductions. But hello, everyone. Great. So we may have some more people coming in, but I think we'll start things off with just Kwe, hello, bonjour, everyone. It's great to see you all out this evening. Just a quick, before we start off on our talk this evening, just a quick introduction of myself. I'm Joanna Jack, and here we have Martina Albert.
Honey, bonjour.
You may recognize us from the introductory video at the beginning of this program. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. And for those of you who are less familiar with Plenty Canada and the program, just a quick overview. Plenty Canada is an Indigenous-led organization. It's a registered not-for-profit with a wonderful grassroots board, with the objective of facilitating access to and sharing resources with Indigenous peoples and other community groups around the world in support of their environmental protection and sustainable development goals. And At Plenty, we recognize that people are part of the environment, and we sustain healthy lives only when the environment as a whole is healthy. Now, as part of that work, Larry McDermott, who sends his regrets this evening, but will be joining us later in the program, who is our executive director. He's been involved in a lot of cross-cultural and environmental work for many decades now, all the way back to the Rio Summit and even earlier than those days in the early 90s. And you'll get an opportunity to hear from him through his talk as well. But this program in its entirety is very much inspired by Larry's work and conversations that we've been having about the importance of learning to work together across cultures, Indigenous and non-Indigenous to Turtle Island. So the program, We Baba Mose Mamiwi, or We Walk the Path Together, this is the first time that we've offered it. And there was particular intention behind our kicking it off at the Healing Place, which you will have learned a little bit about in your program package. That place was the result of collaborative efforts of individuals, Mohawk, Algonquin, and non-Indigenous to Turtle Island, from a variety of organizations who really took the time to slow down, to learn from each other, and to identify how they wanted to work together in order to create the kind of space that this program is all about. So that project is one example of things that can happen. And the program itself looks at ethical space, which Willie Irvine identified as being a way of working respectfully across different ways of the world. So in this case, between practices of folks Indigenous and non-Indigenous to Turtle Island. And it's been identified that when we work or exchange ideas together, most of the time, many of us fall into a default. It's often a Western way of doing things, and that can intentionally or not push others to the side, which is an important issue. But the other issue is that without realizing it, we're also missing out on wider views of the world and a richer understanding of the cultures that we're lucky enough to be engaging with. So the program is going to present a series of speakers and discussions, as well as a special workshop on gift giving, which is a very important component of what we're referring to as ethical space. And by now you'll have received your welcome package. You'll have gotten a link to the special video that we created at the Healing Place, and you'll have received confirmation about the facilitated discussions that'll be following this talk. So tonight, as with all of our sessions with special guest speakers, we've invited you all together in the webinar session. So if you don't have video enabled, you will still have opportunity for questions at the end. And you're welcome to join us in the chat box. And it is my great pleasure to introduce you all tonight to our greatly esteemed knowledge keeper, Rick Hill Sr. Rick is a citizen of the Beaver Clan of the Tuscarora Nation of the Haudenosaunee Grand River. He holds a master's degree in American Studies from the State University of New York at Buffalo, was the assistant director for public programs at the National Museum of the American Indian, Smithsonian Institution, museum director at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and assistant professor, Native American Studies at the State University of New York, Buffalo. Currently, he's the Indigenous Innovation Specialist at Mohawk College in Hamilton, Ontario. He's a phenomenal teacher and educator with a vast depth of knowledge that he has so generously offered to share with us this evening. And it's with great pleasure that I pass things over to you, Rick.
I thank you. Nyawe Scano Guaguego. That's an old Seneca greeting. Says Nyawe means I'm thankful. Scano that you are all well and hopefully will stay awake for the next 2 hours. And Guaguego just applies for me to all of you. I'd like to share a few things here. First, I'm going to be showing a PowerPoint. that has some of our stories about wampum. For those of you that aren't familiar with wampum itself, it is, oops, sorry. Wampum is made from tiny shell beads from clams from the Atlantic Ocean. They're carved and drilled and woven into designs that carry memory. That's why I'm referring to this wampum memory. This memory gives us an insider's view in history. It's not my insider view, but the beads themselves. They're the witness to history. They've been passed on over the generations. So this is why it's important to understand what it is. But I'll also say wampum is a great mystery because when I was young, I didn't know anything about wampum. I only heard about him about 1971. I began to hear these stories about the Great Law of Peace and how our ancestors used to use wampum. But when I asked, well, can you show me one? They said, no, all of the wampum has been taken by museum folks and anthropologists and collectors. It was all stored away in New York City and Washington and Ottawa. I found this old photograph of a collection of wampum belts that were at Grand River. That's where I lived. That's where my father is from. He's a Mohawk from Grand River. I'm a Tuscarora. We follow our mother's side of the family, but we're one people, Haudenosaunee, Haudenosaunee, people who build a longhouse. And we used wampum to communicate internal messages to when we made treaties and agreements. So look at this wide variety of designs. Each one has a specific meaning. Now, a particular belt could have been used several times. It may actually have layers of meanings. But tonight we're going to look at some, particularly the one in the middle with the big zigzag design. The one, I don't know if you can see it, with the two men holding this chain or link between them. Now you notice this gentleman. Now this is a very old photograph, probably about 1871. But unfortunately, we haven't recovered all of these belts, nor do we know the story of them all. So let's take a look at what the larger issue is. Tonight we're going to look at how Canada was shaped, how it was formed because of wampum diplomacy. Kanata, it's a Haudenosaunee word. It means a village or this settlement, this place. And just like they talk about it, that pole standing in the water. So I just picked this picture, trying to imagine what it must have looked like to our ancestors going by on a canoe. But it is kind of ironic. You see these two coins from Canada. They've adopted the maple leaf. Now it's a very sacred tree to our people, the Haudenosaunee, but they also are honoring La Crosse. I'll notice the date on there, 1636. That was reportedly the first time that a colonist, a missionary, saw lacrosse being played among our people. It's one of the oldest games there are, and it later became the official national summer sport of Canada, where winter is the official winter sport. So Canada's history and our history are tied together in one. For our point of view, for the Indigenous people, this ancestral voices, the voices of the land, you could say the voices within the earth, like it's mentioned, in the rocks, within the trees, and in these wampum belts. So when you actually pick up a wampum belt, it's like you're having a conversation then with people you never met, but people who had you in mind, as they sent their message forward through that wampum belt. They want you to know that. Most of us come from an oral tradition. Our oral history is our view of history, what took place. It was the memory of our ancestors. It's explained to them. You're not often going to find those stories in history books. And like I said, unfortunately, we haven't been able to uncover all of the ancestral voices attached to the wampum belts, but I'll share with you tonight what we have been able to find out. So think of wampum belts as woven words that are put together almost like assembling a book. There's like a paragraph of topics that go through this. When you hold the wampum belt, the thinking is the message that's in the bead will vibrate to you, send that message to you, you're the speaker, and you recite the words. It's not like you're a robot, but it helps you with its memory. It helps you explain its memory. Now, at the same time, we used to train young people, particularly young men, how to be the oral historians. We would tell them the story of these belts. They would remember it. But we also told them, you have to use your own mind to make the story come alive. So I'll say right now, I may make a few mistakes tonight. I'm not holding wampum as I talk. My memory is a little older. I'm 71 years old, but I'm going to share with you the best that I can. I'm not a knowledge keeper. I'm a knowledge sharer. our ancestors shared that knowledge through wampum, and all I'm doing is sharing some of those ideas with you. But you can see the wide variety of designs, and we'll talk about several of these belts. The wampum is also associated with treaty making. In fact, Canada would not have been formed or not be here if it wasn't for wampum diplomacy. It started with the French, it started with the Dutch, the French, the English, and they would use these wampum belts as a diplomatic courier, going back and forth. When an agreement was made, the terms of that agreement were woven into the belt. But look at this photograph for a minute. It kind of reminded me, think about this. How on earth did our ancestors, all of our ancestors who spoke different languages, come from different worldviews, different cultures, how are they able to communicate? And I like this photograph. As you see, you talked about that ethical space, that sacred space. It's almost like the space between their hands. See, something's going on there that helps you. And that's what our ancestors said, that our minds can become linked if we share in this process, this wampum process. The wampum has its own life, its own vitality. It helps you get those ideas out of your head, kind of filtered through your heart to make sure they're true and shared earnestly. So treaty making is more than just words on a paper. And unfortunately, you go to court, that's all they talk about. It's also the oral history of what was agreed to that is captured by these wampum belts. So those of you who are Haudenosaunee are aware of that. We have this great law of peace. It's the founding law of the Haudenosaunee form of government. That happened well over 1,000 years ago. I'd like to say it's probably the original treaty in this land because it brought 5 different nations and eventually the 6th nation, the Tuscaroras, we joined together. This is a painting I made as I began to learn this story of the significance of wampum. Here are the 2 principals. On the left is a guy, they named him the peacemaker. His assistant called Hiawatha. They're holding this wampum belt. I made a copy of the exact wampum belt in my painting that talks about the unification of the 5 nations. And as you can see in that belt, which is there's a better view of it, an actual photograph of it. So the original of this belt was, like I said, made about 1,000 years ago. But in handling the belt and using it, it begins to become worn and was probably rewoven several times. But like I said, this belt was taken from our communities in about 1890. It used to be held by Onondagas, the Onondaga Nation, or the wampum keepers of the Haudenosaunee. For whatever reason, they relinquished these belts. They went to the New York State Museum. So when I was a young man, I wanted to see wampum belts. Like I mentioned, people say, well, we don't have any. So I began to find out why, what happened, where are the belts? And that was part of then my responsibility to my people is to help recover them. So today I'm proud to say that me and along with a few others, we were successful, quite successful in recovering about 400 different wampum items, strings of wampum, bags of wampum, but also many wampum belts. The problem is, when we had these belts, we could tell their story, like this, the formation of Confederacy. You can see the 5 nations, the Tree of Peace planted on the territory of the Onondagas. But after a while, when the belts were taken away, they hold the memory, and our ancestors did the best they could to remember the oral history. But in 100 years, you're going to forget a lot of things. You're going to forget how to say things. That memory gets a little weak. So think of it this way. We've only recovered these belts since about 1986. And we've been in relationship with them, trying to get their story, trying to recover what it is our ancestors had in mind when they wove these belts. So it's creating a very rich cultural dialogue among our own people as to what is the meaning of these things. So like I mentioned, this is a drawing by Oren Lyons, an Onondaga leader, showing the peacemaker holding this cane. We call it condolence cane. It shows all the titles of the chiefs. I'll explain in a minute. See his helper there holding strings of wampum that shows the unity. The peacemaker holds a bundle of arrows tied together. That was one of the symbols that if you take one single arrow, it's easy to break, but if you bind them together, they become strong. And that was the underlying message of the great law of peace. That if we use our good mind and treat each other fair and also address all of the matters that are in front of us in a good way, we build this unity of our minds. And once you unify your minds together, you become very strong. and you become so strong, you're able to perpetuate peace. Sometimes when we think of joining together for strength, we think of dominating over others. Well, this was a different concept. This was the strength of the mind, strength of the heart, strength of the spirit will allow peace to continue. So that's why we say Nyawa Scano, that we're thankful that you're not only well, but you're at peace, that it continues on. Here's two wampum belts associated with the Great Law. You see that tree? They say that when the original chiefs were gathered together, the peacemaker planted this tree. It's a white pine. So when you drive around on the Ontario landscape, you look to the woods, usually the tree you'll see poking out the top of the woods is a white pine. It's called the everlasting tree, meaning that peace will never grow old if people's hearts are committed to that. Peace won't grow old among our people when all of you that are listening begin to embrace peace and build peace between people. You got to put aside a lot of old animosities, some old struggles and all of that stuff, because the Creator wants us to enjoy peace. So he sent the eagle to us as a messenger to protect peace. The eagle landed on top of that pine tree to sound a warning. So sometimes you're out in the woods, you're driving around, all of a sudden you hear that eagle screeching. He's actually, it's a special kind of screech, but he's bringing you some warning. Something's coming. Beware that something's coming that could upset your people. This other belt dealt with this legendary figure. His name was Tadadaho. He was kind of an evil man. And the whole story of the Great Law is these two men, along with the other leaders, had to overcome this Tadadaho figure. But there's an important lesson there. They used their good minds, they combined their spiritual strength, and they transformed Tadadaho's thinking. So they didn't arrest him, try him, and execute him for the crimes that he did against humanity. They transformed his character, made him a man of peace. That's what this wampum belt talks about. And they gave him then some special duties. So today there is a man, an Onondaga man, who carries the same title, Tadadaho, that he has a responsibility to convene the Grand Council meetings in the territory of the Onondagas in Syracuse, New York. He sets the agenda, he operates the meetings, he mediates disputes between the leaders. He's got a very important role. But you see what I'm saying? They took somebody who was a dissenter, a disruptor, transformed their thinking, and then made them a proponent of peace. So that's why that wampum belt, although we see those 14 diamonds going down the middle, we could still feel, it still feels like this tree growing. There's three major bars on that to represent these three laws or principles of the Great Law. That we have to have a use of good mind. We got to create a unity of our thought and our being. And if we do so, we will then enjoy perpetual peace. That's a message that applies to everybody, not just the government. You can apply that to your own life and how to build a constructive Indigenous relationship. So I mentioned they planted a tree of peace, and they made this wampum here. You see this double circle of wampum represents the Great Law and the great peace that results from the application of that law. Hanging from there are 50 individual strands that represent the 50 leaders that we have, the male leaders. So they call them chiefs, but really hoyane are men of goodness. Along with the male leaders, the peacemaker picked a female leader, we call a clan mother or goyane. She's there to help balance, you could say, the thinking of the men with the thinking of the women. She looks after the people in her clan. So technically, we have 49 clans among the Haudenosaunee that are all named after 9 different animals. Although we have 50 leaders, because one of the leaders, Tadadaho, when they stood him up, when they made him a chief, they said he doesn't have a clan because he belongs to everybody. So anyway, it's very interesting. This is a seating arrangement. This is how our chiefs are supposed to sit in a council meeting. So there's the original 5 nations put together. I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, if you're Haudenosaunee, if you're like me, when you were born, you're born inside that circle, right in the middle. All the laws, the traditions, beliefs of your people are available to you. The chiefs and the clan mothers provide a perimeter defense. Imagine they're standing in that circle there, trying to with their arms linked together, creating a strong circle. When they did stand there, and the tree was planted, and the bundle of arrows was shown, and the eagle landed, the peacemaker also said, we're going to have now a meal. We're going to share a meal from one dish. It's going to have one spoon. And that dish is going to contain a beaver tail. So here's the wampum belt that talks about that. And the dish is one spoon. And I call it an ecological treaty because it's our treaty with nature, that we're going to derive sustenance from nature, but there's some rules attached to that. So that figure in the middle represents a dish. The white rectangle represents that beaver tail. You can see one here roasting on the fire. Any of you ever had a beaver tail, you know how delicious it is. But the concept here is we're no longer going to fight each other. Especially we're not going to fight over food, over who has the right to hunt. What the dish with one spoon says, every one of you participate in this discussion. Everyone has an equal right to take from the dish, provided they follow these simple rules. One is you only take what you need, or food or medicine. It's like to take care of yourself now. You always leave something in the dish for other people that follow. You're sharing that. And that you make sure you keep the dish clean, that you don't waste animals, you don't waste what nature provides. Because nature, Mother Earth, she was built to provide us with all of these great resources to help maintain ourselves. So Yahweh Scano, I'm thankful that you are well in your thinking, well in your spirit, and well in your physical body. Healthiness, peacefulness are tied together. And as we all know, when you eat well, you feel good. You're satiated, as they say, meaning that you're satisfied. And then it allows your mind to work well. If you're hungry, the hunger eats away at you and it disrupts your thinking. So good nutrition is a very important part of maintaining peacefulness. And I can tell you right now, you're not going to find it at McDonald's or Tim Hortons. You got to go back into the woods and get that food that the Creator intended for us to have. So let's talk a little bit about history and how wampum has helped us understand what took place. This belt here was made as a result, it's called the first sighting of the people with pale faces. About 1535, these French ships come down the St. Lawrence. They landed at a place near Quebec City. There was a village of people there. Now, we believe they were Mohawks, or at least they were Iroquoian-speaking people. But when they arrived, because of their long journey across the ocean, they were quite ill. They were suffering from a disease called scurvy, which is the lack of certain vitamins. And they began to die. And that disease is infectious also. It began to affect the native people. So see the wampum belt here? Now, when a wampum belt is white, it's talking about something, some goodness, some good thought, peacefulness, some strength. The other color is purple, and usually if the background is purple, it's talking more darker times, something happening that wasn't so good. Now, those are the only two colors we have, so we kind of interplay with that here. You'll see a lot of wampum belts have these diagonal lines on them. They're called rafters. Just like any of you built a house or seen a house going up, they put the rafters on the roof to strengthen it. So whenever we made an agreement or whether something good happened, we're strengthening the house because we are people of the longhouse, people who build the longhouse. So in the drawing, you can see there, a native showed up and taught them how to make some medicine tea to address this illness that they were suffering. So this probably was Jacques Cartier. You can see him here on the left and his crew that came down the St. Lawrence. They took this medicine tea and they were quite strengthened. So the wampum belt talks about this. You see there's two kind of heavier lines. That represents the native people because we're strong. And in the middle is a thinner line. That was the frail French people that arrived in 1535. We stood them up. We strengthened them. And ironically, or unfortunately, they don't seem to appreciate that. They ended up kidnapping a few of the Mohawks that were there, took them back to France, who unfortunately passed away, and a whole era of strife was born. But we'll talk a little bit about that. That started, at least among the Haudenosaunee, with this attack from Champlain. So, well, like I said, the first one was 1535. They began to colonize Canada, began to meet with all kinds of people. But in 1609, for whatever reason, Samuel Champlain decided to invade Mohawk country, and they came down to what they call Lake Champlain today, just north of Albany. And this was the first time my ancestors saw firearms, saw guns. And you can imagine the mystery and the awe and the fear that that created. Now, a friend of mine says he felt there was a kind of a ceremonial war that took place between the Hurons and Abenakis and the Haudenosaunee. In other words, we would gather together, not to hurt each other, but it was kind of like contests of strength. And if you can imagine, kind of like Olympic events, you know. And yeah, we might shout some insults at each other and might shoot some arrows without tips. But the idea is that it's kind of, I don't know, a way for men to burn off some energy. But when Champlain showed up, because obviously it was kind of a prearranged gathering, he had 3 men there who had these firearms. And when he asked his Abenaki and Huron allies, who should I shoot? They said, shoot the men with 3 feathers. Now, among the Mohawks, the 3 feathers represent their nation, but back then, their leaders, their chiefs wore these 3 feathers in their hair. So they pulled the trigger and bang, these guns went off. And before you know it, there were several men laying on the ground, including those men with 3 feathers in their hair. And it wasn't a very long engagement because the rest of the Mohawks that were there said, how do we fight this? Well, how do we deal with that? So this wampum belt, remember what I said, the purple background talks about something that wasn't so good. You can see there are 5 of these octagons, kind of looks like the stop signs in that belt. You see those little white lines at the end. They talk about the intrusion of the French into our territory and bringing these weapons of destruction. But they also wore this armor. They had big beards on their faces. And so this belt talks all about that. Of who are these people that are coming in? Why are they attacking us? And what's our response going to be? Well, eventually it led into war. The Haudenosaunee began to fight with the French and their native allies pretty fiercely. This belt was used to declare war. Back then, the protocol was, I said, let's say we wanted to fight. We'd make a belt like this. You see it's purple again. You actually would paint it red. So when you picked it up, the red would drip off the belt, symbolizing the blood that's going to be spilled. But you would send the wampum belt over to the people you want to fight with. If they picked it up, that meant the fight was on. If they didn't, they just left it there on the ground, that means you couldn't fight. So even in war, the wampum diplomacy was very important. I've tried to figure out what are these 2 symbols are. You know, you see these diamonds that are linked together. And it wasn't until I read about the War of 1812, at the conclusion of the war, there was a big gathering and our leaders got up. The first ones to get up were the war chiefs. They said, we're the ones who were doing the fighting. We're the ones who wielded the tomahawks. We're the ones who went to the battlefield. We're the ones who suffered the sting of conflict. So when we put the war to rest, we take our weapons of war and put them in the ground. And then we turn the negotiation for peace over to what they called the peace chiefs, the Hoyanics, the men of peace. So I'm not saying this is absolutely true, but this is what got me thinking that maybe these double diamonds represent that. The 2 kind of primary leaders of deciding on war, deciding when war is over, and then to make peace again. There were a lot of wampum belts that had the symbols of a hatchet or a tomahawk. Those are also symbols of war. You paint the belt red, send it over, and you can see how it looks like. So here's a painting that was done about, it says 1780, around that time there. There's actually this man, Lieutenant John Caldwell. His mother was a Mohawk, but he was an officer in the British military. But he learned how to speak both Mohawk and Anishinaabe languages. You can see he decorated himself quite effectively. He would carry these wampum belts. So when the British wanted us to go to war with them against the French, they would bring a wampum belt like this, present it to us. When the French wanted us to go to war against the English, they would also bring a wampum belt. Generally, I said the purple background talks about that dark time. And these are just different wampum belts, so different symbols of that tomahawk. But see, he's holding that tomahawk. And you got to remember, That tomahawk came through the fur trade. It's got a pipe bowl on one side. You could smoke it to make peace, and it's got a sharp hatchet on the other side. And if peace doesn't work, then you might want to go to war. That's the tomahawk that our warriors would give back to the crown after a fight. Say, we did your bidding. Now we're putting that pipe down. Now the peace chiefs are going to take over. So we started fighting with the French left and right, and all of a sudden the Dutch showed up. And the Dutch came up from New York City. They actually had they developed a colony down there called New Amsterdam. They brought their ships up the Hudson River, and they met with the Mohawks about 1613. Now, remember what I said? Trying to imagine, how do people who speak different languages, how do they communicate? Here's what the Turo says. The Creator wants us to live in peace. He sent his vibrations of peace into the mind of the Mohawk man and into the mind of the Dutchman, so that when they did meet on this, where the rivers came together, they automatically wanted to find a way to make peace. And they reached out and shook each other's hands. Some people say it's like shaking your arms like this, but whatever they said, somehow they communicated that we want to make this friendship treaty. And they said, in order to do that, we have to find a way for our people to relate to one another. And in their dialogue, so they're talking and they're organizing this thought, they're coming to an agreement. Then they probably made a wampum belt afterwards, or soon afterwards. This was the belt that was made, the 2 rows. You can see why it's got the name. Now this is the actual version of it. You can see it's a little tattered and torn, much like our relationship. But it talked about 2 symbols that are put together. One is the path of a canoe. Inside the canoe are the indigenous laws, traditions, beliefs. The other is the path of the ship. It's a picture of a Dutch ship. And then inside that ship are its laws, traditions, and beliefs. What they did is they tied these 2 vessels together. They tied the canoe and the ship together to travel down what they're calling the River of Life. So a lot of people call this Gaswenta, but actually Gaswenta is the name, it just means a wampum belt. So all of the wampum belts are Gaswenta, but in this particular one, these 2 rows. So this whiteness represents the idea that there should be goodness, but notice there's that ethical space between the 2 rows. That's where we're supposed to engage. That's where it's supposed to be safe to engage. And then there's space on either side. That's where we maintain our traditions, our beliefs, our languages, and that. But they also said the 2 are not supposed to interfere with each other. People of the ship are not supposed to try to steer the people of the canoe. And the people of the canoe aren't supposed to try to steer the people of the ship. So I kind of get all flustered about this, as there's such a move to indigenize everything. Indigenize the academy, indigenize the courts, indigenize everything. But when you think about it, those are instruments of the ship. They're not from the canoe, and we have to be careful that we don't mix these things up too much. Here's what they said. You have to be careful where you put your feet. If you try to put 1 foot in the canoe, 1 foot in the ship, a big wind's going to come, and that usually represents like a fight. It's going to push those 2 vessels apart, and you're going to fall into the deep, dark water. And what the Turo says, there's no power on earth that can retrieve you from that. Only the Creator, if he wants you to come to the surface. Well, here's another thing they said as they're making this. I think it was the Dutchman who said, what happens if people from the ship want to get in the canoe? The Mohawk man thought about it for a minute and he says, well, that's true. He said, but you know what will also happen? People of the canoe will want to get in the ship. So let's agree to this. This is very important. This is what they agreed to in 1613. Whatever vessel you find yourself in, you'll be governed by its rules. Now, to me, that means if you go to the university, you abide by university rules. That's the educational institution of the ship. When you come to our longhouse, you follow our protocol. You abide by our rules of our community. But you can see the problem it created. Kind of like where once there was one world, one worldview, one common way of looking at things. All of a sudden now we got two different worldviews. So I grew up in the 50s, literally balancing between these two things. I taught at the State University of New York at Buffalo, go to the Longhouse, I live in a community and plant corn, I do exhibits at the Smithsonian. I kind of felt like I was always bouncing back and forth, but always careful. So then one time, an old guy told me, he says, well, Rick, the way we live today, you can't help but have some of the ship in some of the canoe. And you can't help but have some of the canoe in some of the ship. He just says, just make sure you understand the difference. Make sure you're firmly grounded in the canoe. And that'll carry you through your life. So I'll share that advice with you. It's not easy, but it's something to think about. Here's another thing now that happened. Whenever we gathered together to make a treaty, we had to first heal each other. Because when you carry wounds of trauma or grief, war or death, you can't think right. So what our ancestors said is they would do this ceremony. They would have these strings of wampum. And this is where kind of like the medicine value of wampum comes in. It would start every meeting this way. The first string they would use to wipe away the tears. So I know some of you probably have lost a loved one recently, and you know what it's like, or the trauma, what's going on with COVID, knowing people are passing away. It creates angst. Your mind gets burdened by this, preoccupied by this. So with this little string of wampum and with a soft deer skin, they would wipe your tears away to unburden your mind, restore a sense of hope. The second one, they would take a string of wampum. With that, they said when you suffer trauma, it's like dust settles over your body, gets into your ears. It was that dust that made your eyes tear up. It gets in your ears and clogs up your hearing. You can't hear people. Even people coming to you with good words, you can't hear them. So we have to use this soft feather of a bird to kind of clean out your ears. That would help to uplift your spirit, because you're going to hear the beautiful sounds of nature. You're going to hear the birds singing. You're going to hear the laughter of children again. And then the third thing we're going to do, again, symbolically, with a string of wampum and a drink of cool water from the earth, we're going to clear your throat, because that dust of death that settles in there creates a lump in your throat. You can't talk. You don't want to eat. So by clearing your throat, we're strengthening your body. So think about this. This is how all treaties started. Unburden your mind so that your mind is healthy. You can make good decisions. Uplift your spirit so your spiritual energy, that fire inside of you, is growing strong. And then second is that we're going to make sure that you're physically healthy, that you're well. And then sometimes they take a fan and dust off your body, make sure your clothes are clean, and wipe your seat to make sure it's clean. But can you see the difference? Now, we stopped doing this because the English no longer want to do it about 1830. I believe this is the exact reason why we have trouble communicating with politicians today, because we haven't wiped our tears since 1830. The treaty fraud in residential schools, and murdered and missing women, and now what they're going on with on and on about providing compensation for kids who are put in care. And so we can't see each other because our eyes are filled with this dust of history and trauma. We certainly know the government can't hear. We start talking to them and it's just like they go deaf. They can't hear what we're saying. And then third, we can't speak to each other, right? We get a lot of anger when we try talking. We're very emotional because see, that thing is clogged in our throat. We gotta cleanse ourselves to be strong, to engage with people from the ship, and we have to help the people of the ship to become strong so they can engage with us more effectively. This is the core of treaty making. Like the French, they had two missions. The French had two primary things they wanted to achieve. One was to establish missions to convert our people to the Catholic faith. And then the other is to develop a fur trade, productive trade. So we have this little section of a wampum belt. It's called the French Fort Wampum Belt. And it talks about them wanting to build their forts in our territory. Now, what you got to realize, can you see down here the five Iroquois nations? That's the Senecas, Cayugas, Onondagas, Oneidas, and Mohawks. That was their primary territory. The French are coming down. Remember, Champlain comes from that top right corner of the map to where Quebec City and Montreal is. See that other lake going down? That's the Champlain Lake. So those other two wampum belts, they relate to that. They're coming down the river, coming down to our territory. So we decided we're going to try to make peace with these people. They asked for permission to build forts in our territory. Now our villages were stockade, meaning they were surrounded by logs. This is a very early drawing of a Onondaga village made by Champlain, 1611, I think it was. Notice in the shape, it's in the shape then of an octagon, like a stop sign. So my interpretation of this belt, again, this is just looking at it, I think that's what it represents. These octagons are maybe almost like our original villages are like a dish, because that's what nourished our people. The forts, the square forts, as you can see here, are kind of mimic from that was on the map. So this is why we say we're the people of the circle, and the Europeans are people of the square. We have a round dance, they have a square dance. Doesn't all make sense? 1656, the French also asked to establish missions among the territory of the Haudenosaunee. My ancestors weren't opposed to that. They just said, well, as long as you don't disrupt things too bad, kind of like some spiritual belief is good for everybody, so let's see what you can do. But you got to remember what was going on during this time. Anybody know? Well, there was a whole series of epidemics sweeping the land. Some of our people actually blame the Jesuits for it. These are Jesuit missions that were established in the territory of the Haudenosaunee that started in 1656. So there is this wampum belt. Now, it's dark in the background. In retrospect, it represents dark times. But here's what happened. The French started making wampum belts to give to us. And the French, they had this affection for purple. It's almost because to them it represents their spiritual beliefs. So a lot of the belts that the French made had this purple background. But we can see those crosses representing their missions. That's what they wanted to establish there. 1658, the Jesuits came to the Onondaga Nation near Syracuse, New York, asked if they could build 1656, they arrived and built this mission there called St. Marie. It didn't last long, only lasted a couple of years. And this belt talked about what happened at that mission. So you can see it's a purple belt, so you know its story. It's a little on the dark side. So we see the cross represents French Canada, the pathway of the missionary to the territory of the Onondaga Nation, which is the diamond below it. And you see there's a black mark in the center chest of this man. Well, here's the oral history of this belt. They say one time they agreed to let the missionary come there. He built his mission. This is a reconstructed version of that mission, maybe a little bigger and fancier than it actually was. But a little Onondaga boy was walking by one of these buildings, and he looked in, and he saw the priests stacking these kegs of powder and bags of lead shot. And he asked them, why are you doing that? Well, the missionary just shoot him along his way. So the little boy went back and told his chiefs what he saw. The chiefs then came and asked what the missionary was doing with powder. It's supposed to be a place of peace. You're here to spread your good word. Why do you have ammunition stored there? So finally, because there was a great fear, the Jesuits who operated this were afraid for their lives. They thought the Onondagas were going to attack them. And it wasn't without justification. Some Jesuits were executed by both the Hurons and the Mohawks. But what this priest said is that the French were coming to attack. And when they arrived, he wanted to make sure they had enough ammunition to defeat the Haudenosaunee. Well, within a night or two, all of those Jesuits escaped and left their this settlement. The Onondagas remembered that and put that into this wampum belt. And at the last part of the belt, it talks about we have our own spiritual traditions. We have our own way to follow. We can't trust these people who, we can't trust the black robes, is what this belt talks about. So probably this is a wampum belt that was made by the Onondagas after this event. It could have been a belt that the Jesuits made and given to the Onondagas to start the fort, but then the Onondagas add their interpretation to it. The British come along, they defeat the Dutch who had made the two-row, and they were working at defeating the French, so they made a separate treaty with the Haudenosaunee, and it's called the Silver Covenant Chain, or the Friendship Belt. And here's those two figures. So ironically now, the crown is the dark figure with the white spot on his chest. The white figure on the left is our native leaders. They're holding a chain, a path that connects two continents. So that chain goes all the way from our council fire to Albany, New York, where the king's representative was, all the way to London, where the king sits. When the king wanted our attention, he would shake that chain. He'd come to the Indian agent would negotiate with us on these matters. And so this belt is very important because it represents that the agreement of the crown to look after our interests. And these are the kind of things that they would do. Whenever we made a covenant chain agreement, we were acknowledging that we're allies and friends of each other. Friendship's important, but we get that from the two-row. But becoming allies, we're going to help each other. We're going to defend each other. We're going to inform each other about the issues that are going on. When we hear things, we'll tell them. When they hear things, they'll tell us. We're going to make amendments for any transgression. Sometimes our citizens are going to harm one another. We're not going to let that harm destroy our relationship, but we're going to find a way to make amends. And that starts with those offers, expressions of condolence. When some, you wouldn't believe these old treaty minutes. If a Mohawk chief passed away, or maybe was killed by the French, the English would put on a grand ceremony to show their deep sympathy for what took place. When the British were attacked, we do the same thing. So that's what families do, right? They kind of help each other through hard times. They would seek justice on a variety of matters, and there's a different kind of justice than what you see today. Today, it's their justice imposed upon us. Back here, it was a balance between English law and Haudenosaunee law. These things had to come together, and that both sides had to feel their interests were protected. We renew our peaceful and prosperous relations, meaning the fur trade. We make sure that the trade is good, the traders are honest, make sure that it flows well, and we would agree on a mutually beneficial course. Wouldn't it be great if we could do the same thing today on all of these matters that we're faced with? But unfortunately, this treaty-making tradition is, like I said, is kind of fallen short. Just going to show a couple more, and then we'll have some questions and take a bit of a break. So the French, though, are converting some people. Remember, that was part of their mission. And so a lot of people lived along the St. Lawrence, Ganawage, Ganasatage, and eventually Akwesasne. They became Catholic converts. And each of these communities, they also had wampum belts. These were again made by the French, given by the French or their French allies, given by the French or the Hurons to the particularly the Mohawks who were settled there. Central to all of those French belts, you can see that cross. The purple, remember I said it's their favorite color, so we see that. So we see these 6 squares, very much like that original Great Law belt. There might have been more, as you can see here. Maybe it looks like maybe there's 6 or 7 tied together in unity around there. And this was an appeal from the Hurons to the people who settled at Ganawage, Kaknawaga, as it was called in the past, to encourage them to accept the faith, this Catholic faith, and to build this chapel, and making sure that they keep the things away, keep the devil away from the work that you do. But that wampum becomes important because it's almost like, here's your title or your right to live in this land that's being provided for you. The Huron have many wampum belts that talk about this long-standing relationship they've had with the French. This was a belt that was shown in the 1820s. You can see the man holding it, and That's the way belts were usually held. They were held vertically, and almost as if you're reading a book as you go down the belt. When they got halfway through, they turn the belt over and read the other half. But I got thinking about that. Now, right away, we assume that that's a hatchet, but when you turn it upside down, it actually could be a peace pipe. So maybe just like the tomahawk, it can be both things, to declare war and to make peace. In this case, these vertical bars, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, probably represented the number of people or communities that were joining into this accord. The diamond probably represented the council fire where this agreement was made. So this Huron leader actually went to meet with King George the Fourth over in England, 1825. They made a speech. There was 4 of them there, and basically he's holding this wampum belt, but he's talking about that. He's really basically saying, "We're really glad that you're looking after your people. We wish you a long life to continue going on with these things, and that we're here to let you know that we are devoted to you as our ally." And although the Huron and the Anishinaabe tended to refer to the crown as our father, the Haudenosaunee always referred to them, or generally, as our brother, because we said, we don't want to call you a father because a father can chastise the son, but if we're brothers, we have this equal standing. So a lot of times the belts are ceremonial to reaffirm the relationship, to send whatever message they have to the parties. And a little bit later, Quebec wanted to confirm the territorial boundaries of the Indigenous communities. And so that chief that we saw there, Chief Vincent, he made a map of their hunting lands. Now, again, this goes back to the founding of Canada, because very, very early, we're designating, these are our hunting lands. This is where we expect to derive an income. And that description, it says here, match the pictographic symbols on the wampum belt. Later, another chief explained that to the superintendent of Indian Affairs. He held this belt, and it was said that these confirm the truth of the matter. Now, unfortunately, I don't know which particular wampum belt they had that they were showing, but it would be great if we had that to show this is what the Hurons considered to be their hunting territory within Quebec. This is 1683, a treaty between the Hurons and the Jesuits for this that allowed the Jesuits to put up a mission. It's very much like the Onondagas. Again, it's purple because the chances are, the Jesuits made this belt. We see the cross in the center. We see figures holding hands, their arms united together as symbols of strength. We can see characters here with long robes, and we assume that are black robes. You see the end designs, which I believe are kind of represent the nature of their communities. And it'd be hard to explain unless you actually saw how these mission communities were established. And then the last one, let's take a break. Because of their faith and their belief, the Hurons, the Wendat, as well as the Abenaki, made wampum belts that they sent back over to France as a testament of their strength. So the top belt in, I guess, Latin at the time, was an offering from the Hurons to the Virgin who shall give birth. Or they talk about this, their belief. So it's very interesting that the wampum began to represent the belief of not only the French, but of their allies. I think so let's look at this belt here. What letters can you see inside the design? Now, I'm not too good at reading Latin, but certainly you can see on the left, see the big B, IRGIN. So that's certainly a virgin. And you get into the middle, I'm not sure, but it looks like a double I and MAC. And at the other side, it looks like HVRDD. I haven't found an interpretation of what this might represent, but this is just one of several hundred wampum belts that have been found or in museums or collections that represents that message. So remember what I said about the woven word in the belt? So even those that converted to the Catholic religion put their heart and their spirit into weaving a message of wampum. So let's take a quick, let's spend a few time here for some questions. I know I've covered a lot of territory there in the beginning, but I wanted to see if anybody had any questions about the material shared so far. I think I'm going to stop sharing that and let's see what you're thinking about so far about all of this stuff.
Thanks, Rick. Martina is taking a look at the chat, and we'll start moderating questions here. For those of you who were here right at the beginning, we do have a little Q&A button at the very bottom of your screen where you can put in questions that you have. And I see a note from Martina as well, highlighting here, feel free to raise your hand or simply type a chat as well in the chat. And questions can be asked in person as well as in writing. So you do have that option, just let us know.
So we do have one question from Teresa, and she is asking, what do hexagons often represent in wampum belts?
I think they're primarily symbols of two things. One, it would represent that dish that we talked about where you gain sustenance, the village, particularly that palisaded village. So it began to represent the place of settlement. Later, the British began to use that to symbolize their forts because they said, come to us, your dish will now be the fort where you come to trade. So I think that's probably what it represented. But again, it's hard to say because you can't just say there's one interpretation for one design that would represent all the stories of the belts, but generally that's what I think.
All right, thanks, Rick. We have another question. Did East Coast and West Coast nations use wampum belts?
I would say wampum was in use right from the Atlantic shore to the Mississippi, and maybe even a little further in. You'll find some wampum in use, like in Minnesota, among the Dakota, all the way down to the southeast. That's pretty much the range of it. Since the shells come from the Atlantic Ocean, and the Dutch turned it into, they manufactured beads that imported through the fur trade. They went on. So you'll find paintings from the 1830s of Great Lakes people that will have a lot of wampum decorations. But wampum belts are also used diplomatically for the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, the Cherokees, the Haudenosaunee, most in the eastern part of North America.
Awesome. Thanks, Rick. And we have a question from Alexandra. Should the wampum belt be returned or any other artifacts?
Yes. Like I said, I spent good 50 years of my life trying to recover these things. But so here's what I learned: the wampum should be returned if you're dedicated to living its message, and have the kind of ability to do that, because it does us no good just take a wampum belt that's been locked up in a museum for 100 years and lock it up in a tribal museum for another 100 years. We got to find a way to make it used. But I also believe the memory of your ancestors are in those beads. So getting those beads maybe will unlock some understanding about what actually took place in the past. But you got to be a little careful, because now some people will try to take advantage of that, try to twist the message to their political agenda of today. But let's get the belts back, find a way to engage with them and protect them and to use them. I think our ancestors created these on purpose so that we remember. So it's our responsibility to learn well what the wampum represents. Most museums are open to requests for what they call repatriation, or some of our communities will call it rematriation, bringing it back to the women in the community, or restoring the culture. So if you get organized, it's worthwhile checking out. First, you should do the research to find out where are the wampum belts from your community. Because we found some Haudenosaunee belts as far away as Leningrad in Russia. So they're all over the world, really, because colonizers took them, passed them on to their friends, their museums, go on and on and on. There's quite a bit of wampum in European museums.
Awesome. That's so interesting. Thanks so much for the questions, everyone, and for your answers here, Rick. We got another one. You said the belts were made of shells. Where were they collected and were they used in other items?
There's two primary shells that they come from. I should have included that in there. One is a clam shell. If any of you ever had steamed clams, a quahog clam, it's called a hard shell clam. And it's got a purple ridge on the inside. When you open it up, you'll see the purple in there. That's where they got the purple beads from. The white beads come from a whelk, which is kind of like, you know, the big shell where you can put it up to your ear and you can hear the ocean or it sounds like the ocean in it. A whelk is a smaller version of that. They break off all the outside and that center shaft is where they would get the white beads from. So our ancestors made beads from shells going way back, long, long, long time ago. A couple thousand years ago to start. And then slowly, as the Europeans come on and provided some metal tools, our beads begin to get smaller and finer, drilling a hole through the bead with a metal drill. So I don't know how our ancestors drilled these beads without metal, but our story is that the beads kind of magically appeared to our people at the formation of the Great Law. So we don't have to argue about who made them first, where they come from, whatever. We just take it on faith that they were gifted to us, if you know what I mean. Now it's true, the older beads are shorter and wider and were drilled from both ends. You can tell that. Later, meaning late 16, early 1700s, the beads become thinner and smaller. Now today, you can actually purchase wampum beads online. There are native groups from Long Island that make contemporary wampum. But it's very hard to get an all purple bead because the clam shells don't grow as big as they used to. The clam shells used to be about 6 inches in diameter. Today they're half that, so it's hard to get a good purple bead. But we go down to the local craft store and buy wampum beads as we need them. Some people now use them in their art. They were also used for clothing decoration, making earrings, chokers, armbands. So wampum was both ornamental, ceremonial, and then it had this function in treaty making.
So Miigwech. Megan asks, how long does it take to make a wampum belt?
Well, of course, that depends on how big it is, but let's just say I've tried to make wampum beads myself. It's a very difficult job. Everybody I know that's tried to make them because the beads shatter. I've made replicas of these wampum belts, and I used to say if you had about a 4-inch wide wampum belt and you're weaving it, you could probably do about an inch and a half in a half hour. Some of these belts have 10,000 beads in them. Literally, it would take weeks of steady weaving. According to the written history, it was the women among the Haudenosaunee who wove most of the wampum belts. When those that became Catholics went up among the French, probably it was the Huron-Wendat women who were making these belts that the French would use. Because I have to tell you, in some treaties, 100 wampum belts would be exchanged at that time. It's an amazing the volume of wampum that was made. So the Dutch actually created a profession. You could be a wampum bead maker or a wampum belt weaver in colonial Netherlands, in Amsterdam. You could make your living doing that because there was such a demand for that all over. Right up until the American Revolutionary War, they were still making wampum beads to trade and to make these diplomatic gifts to our ancestors. So that's why I say wampum is very much a part of the fabric of treaty making. And then it became scarce and the industry kind of died out. And so I think that's why also they stopped making wampum. The last belt that we have, I'm going to show you a little bit later, is only about 1815. That was the last time the British gave us a wampum belt, 1815. So we're past due. They owe us quite a few.
We have another question here. Is there any way we can advocate for the returns of wampum belts? What can we do to assist, if anything?
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting, you know, if the Pope does come to Canada, the Vatican has several wampum belts that they haven't shared much information on them. And I think we should, apologies one thing, but the action part, dealing with residential schools is one thing, but I think it would be very interesting if the Vatican would share with us uh, even photographs of what wampum belts do you have in your collection. Some of those Catholic wampum belts were stored in churches, and then, like I said, they went overseas. Generally, the museum in Ottawa, other museums across Canada have returned some wampum belts, at least to the Haudenosaunee. I don't think the Anishinaabe have been as aggressive as we have about requesting them back, or the Huron-Wendat. So if you do your homework, what belts came from your community or a community that you're in alliance with, help them to identify that, and then follow where are those belts, and then help them craft a letter to the director of that society, their board chair. Most museums will have a collections committee that takes these kind of requests. And what we've learned in the past, there's three things you could do. You could ask for the belt outright, and that negotiation might take a couple of years. You could ask for the belt to be loaned to a local institution just so your people could see it, and get used to it. We've also then made replicas of the belt, kind of trade them. Well, here's a modern replica. You take the replica and we'll take the original back and use that. But you have to have a safe place to store it. Remember, these things are very old. Some of them are fragile, and so they have to be taken care of properly. Sometimes just handling them can break a bead. So they're delicate, even though they've lasted a long time when you think about it. Beads that have been around since the 1613 or 1,000 years ago. That's really kind of amazing.
For sure, sure. How was it decided when or who could weave a wampum belt?
Well, the peacemaker talked about Hiawatha went and organized the making of the first great law belts, and he commissioned some of the early chiefs to help do that. So there's no real formal way. It's just when it's needed, the local indigenous governance would say, okay, we need this belt, would find people who knew how to do it and make that. For the British and the French and the Dutch, they do the same thing. We want to do this belt. Sometimes they sketch out a design. Then they would go find either native or immigrant belt makers and commission them to do that. But most of them were commissions. A lot of times the Jesuit talk about sometimes some of the nuns, as part of their mission, would also weave the wood belts together. So there's no real strict formula for how the belts got produced.
Were the shells very hard to gather or require trade amongst nations to obtain or build wampums in a timely fashion before Dutch manufacturing?
Yes, because one thing about if you want to make beads, you got to get the shells fresh. They can't dry out too much, so you can't have a whole lot of inland trading because they're going to dry out. So a lot of the beads were actually made on the Atlantic coast by the Narragansett and the Pequots, who then traded them to the Dutch, who then the Dutch traded finished beads. So there was really quite a lucrative market. That's why in a lot of school books, it'll say that wampum is a form of colonial money or Indian money. Well, it's not really true. It's part of the Dutch economy, but for us, it had a very deeper meaning than that of money. But it was used in trade. Certain things are, people would go to a trading post and they would trade for strings of wampum beads because they're precious. And from about 1650 to maybe 1720, oh, there was a great demand for wampum beads. Tecumseh made wampum. All of the Black Hawk, all of the Great Lakes leaders used wampum to send messages to their allies, to kind of enlist people into their cause. And then between native nation and native to other native nations, wampum was also the form of diplomacy. We'll see a few about that in the next part. So let's get to that here so that we have some time at the end for some more questions. I think I can pick this up for where I left off. Just another view of one of these French belts, again, huge belt, it's all purple. We see the cross in the middle, figures joined together. So the symbols from the older wampum is retranslated again with a little bit different purpose. But let's take a look at this particular belt. Now, it's no coincidence it's called the two-dog wampum belt. That's because in the 1780s, a Mohawk man presented this belt and he explained what the symbols represented. The white line across the bottom represents the full length of their land. This is from Kanesatake. This belt was made when Kanesatake was received that land where their community is at. The figures with joined hands represent their loyalty to the Catholic faith, symbolized by that central cross. The two outward-facing dogs at each end guard the boundaries of the land and give warning of interference. Remember, talk about the eagle? Well, by this time, it was dogs, or some people would say a wolf clan people protecting that. So the belt is very interesting. The belt becomes, if you lay it out, it's almost like a map of Kanesatake territory and a kind of a roll call of what the responsibilities of people are in that community. But even the fact that they had to have the dogs to protect their land, as we know later, in 1990, it became a very contested issue. So they must have even sensed back then that our right to defend our land is encoded in these wampum belts. There was a big treaty up in Montreal in 1701 with 24 nations gathered together. They finally made peace with the Haudenosaunee and other Anishinaabe people. They got all of their leaders to attest to it. It was in this commemorative stamp. I put this belt down here because it was actually called Black Hawk's wampum belt. A lot of people associated Black Hawk with the Sacred Fox leader, but I think it's an earlier leader, Black Hawk. It talks about bringing the people together, because if we see here in this particular belt, there's three different kinds of figures. Now remember that octagon. Now here it's kind of scrunched together, and you got the checkerboard ones on the top. You got a diamond in the middle, and then you have more octagons, open octagons at the other end. So to me, it represents, again, these nations, 4 on one side, 4 on the other, coming together around that central council fire, almost like, if you can imagine, that's like stacked logs. The central path means the path of peace. They're unifying themselves. The dark belt would mean that it was during a time of strife. It actually been a time of war. It could have been a call to war. Join us in this fight here. But again, some of these details are hard to say because the message has been lost through time. This belt's been associated with that great peace treaty in Montreal in 1701, although I can't say for sure, but the designs are very interesting. Could very much have been a belt produced by the French himself. You can see the diagonals I talked about, and then these steps in the middle. All of those are the concept of reinforcing the house, building a stronger house, building a stronger relationship. There's some Huron-Wendat belts that talk about their treaty with the one on the bottom, talks about their treaty with the Senecas to share the beaver hunting lands. Now, close your eyes a little bit. Can you see the beaver design and the belt on the bottom? See the head of the beaver on one side, the big round body, and the big tail. Once they made the agreement, they then cut the belt in two. Huron-Wendat took one half of the belt, and the Senecas took another. On top, we see a cross. It doesn't always represent Christianity, because this here looks to me like this, more like this 4 direction symbol. Whatever, it's talking about Huron land. This belt is interesting. I call it the Wandering Path belt. And there's many references to this in their treaty making. It was an arduous journey to come to the council fire to make treaty, to go over mountains, through valleys, through swift rivers, over fallen trees, a lot of rocks in the way. So imagine you're traveling in that zigzag path. But what is the path? Take a close look at it. It's nothing more than two rows, just like the 2-row wampum, but now the journey's become a lot arduous, a lot more treacherous. Attached to it was this little medallion that for years the scholars called it a turtle. But when I looked at it, I said, well, maybe because it's my clan is the beaver. My dad is a turtle clan, but we follow our mother's side of the family. So that's not a turtle, that's a beaver. So this agreement between these two allies to meet probably had to do with the fur trade. And maybe this what it's about. This wampum belt's in the British Museum. We haven't got it back because we don't know for sure like who produced it, where did it come from? Because unfortunately, museum records are not always as great as you might think. I wanted Larry to see these belts because these talk about the boundary between the Algonquian and the Haudenosaunee communities. Now, that's quite a range, 1535 to 1607, because again, we don't know exactly. Sometimes these belts are made without a written record, but let's take a look at the top one. It's as if there's this buffer zone between our people. That's the purple line in the middle. Our nations are gathered on that line, and then we have like a boundary. The natural boundary was usually rivers, sometimes mountain ranges, sometimes a valley. So that's what you see there. Basically, the top half, that's the Algonquin land. On the lower half, that's the Haudenosaunee land. We meet in the middle. And why do we meet? Well, it's to share that bounty that the earth provides, the hunt. I tell you, there was one meeting where our ancestors said, our Mohawk ancestors said to the Algonquin people, can you send some of your hunters down to our people? Because you guys sure know how to hunt. And we would like to learn from you. Or whenever we were up there, they always said, we're going to gather together. We're going to have a great feast from a shared dish, from a shared kettle. We're going to have one spoon. We're all going to enjoy it together. So despite what was going on between the French and the English, our people always tried to make amends and tried to live in peace. But unfortunately, the fur trade made things a little chaotic. The bottom belt is the same thing about this boundary belt, but I don't know the details about it other than purple. So it's probably after a strife between our people, maybe a new agreement was made. So now we see that hexagon with the cross in the middle. So this could very much be the Catholic communities that existed in Canada during that same period. The Algonquin people also have some wampum belts. This is their honored leader from the past, William Commanda, who became the keeper of these wampum belts. He provides an interpretation of the meaning of these belts. Originally, there were several belts, and the Algonquin people spent a lot of time dealing with the Haudenosaunee. They'd come down and we'd share our wampum dialogue. It's hard to see in this belt here, but this next picture shows you some of the details. The top one is very interesting because it has glass beads woven into the shell beads. There was a man from Tuscarora named Clinton Rickard. He became allied with the Algonquin people. He's the one who started the annual border crossing. You know, that every year they have a celebration of our free right to cross the border due to the Jay Treaty. He got entrusted with these wampum belts from the Algonquin people. And then after a while, they asked for them back. They made that belt for him as a kind of like their gift. Thank you for looking after our wampum belts. They made this one here, that central path, the allies. The lines at the end represent the nations of the doors joining together. Again, you can see that in a huge belt, those kind of condensed octagon there represent the nations or the council fires. I believe the double one would be the central fire. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This could very well be what was called the Seven Nations of Canada. The Seven Nations are interesting because, and they kind of vary through time. But again, this goes from the Hurons at Laureate. We could see the Abenakis communities, the Mohawk communities, Oneida Onondagas, Oswegatchie, all joined together, and they made a confederacy. So this belt on the top is associated with them. Some people, the interpretation, you see those double kind of symbol look like mountains. Well, you know, Gunasataga is known as the Lake of Two Mountains. It's one of their names. So people have thought that that's what that represented. We can see these 7 different crosses representing those different communities. But this belt was delivered back to the Haudenosaunee when the 7 nations made amends because they kind of fought against each other during the French and Indian Wars, and they returned to the Grand Council fire. And what it says, according to that interpretation, these 7 nations talk about their wandering path. They wandered away from the tradition. Now they're coming back. So I don't know, again, there's several different interpretations about which one is actually true, but I think we need to start looking at that. What do we know about these kind of events? What happened among our people? And not to look at each other as enemies, but say, okay, what's our common history? What can we learn from these things? 1763, there was a great treaty council at Fort Niagara and Fort George. At Fort Niagara, Sir William Johnson met with the Haudenosaunee. At Fort George, he met with the Anishinaabe people, and he extended the covenant chain. Remember that one belt that I showed you? From Fort Niagara to the Western Confederacy. He also delivered a wampum belt we see in the top. That was renewed a couple of years later, or 20 years later, with the belt below it. You can see Sir William Johnson. Well, that's the way that they described his name. You can see the date on the one on top, 1764, 1786. Two figures joined together. Again, you can see their heart at the center of the chest and those hexagons. And that's why I say I think that represents the British forts. Come to our fort and we'll feed you. Our fort will become the dish that takes care of our allies. And there was a couple other belts that were given at the time, but let's look at the one at the bottom. What Sir William said is that if the 24 nations that were there at the meeting would remain strong allies, we would link our arms together and we're going to pull this ship. See the ship on the lower right? And it's heavy. Why is it heavy? Because it's full of trade goods. It's full of presents. It's silverware, clothes, all kinds of goods that are going to be delivered to the king's allies. They're going to pull that ship all the way across to that figure on the left. That's the mountain. That represents Montreal. That's where the Indian department there, Indian Affairs, was headquartered at that time. So Sir William said, if you all remain strong allies among yourselves, the king will provide these presents every year. And like I said, that continued until about 1830, maybe 1840. Every year we used to have treaty annuities, but they stopped doing that. And then the crown just said, it's too expensive, we're not going to do it anymore. You're not allies of the crown, you're subjects to the crown. So that's what makes wampums like these important, is it shows the foundation of our agreement. Unfortunately, all four of these belts have disappeared in history. There were some drawings made of them, and that's where these replicas are woven from that. And now we use them to keep that dialogue going about what happened, what kind of agreements were made among our people. And there's some very mysterious belts. These are two down at the Smithsonian that I saw. The top one was originally associated with Tecumseh, but now later they said probably not. We do see these two central figures. Again, the styles there, the figure with the, now it doesn't necessarily mean a dark heart, but it represents their heart. Probably holding a flag. We can see houses on one side and we can see lodges on the other. It talked about the unity of the Allies to the British during the War of 1812. Down below, it's a little harder to see, but it has a whole series of figures. We can see the pipe. We can see those diagonal rafters I talked about. Then there's this very interesting, strange figure in the middle, which kind of central path that looked like a mountain or a house at the end. Two figures joined together in hands. So holding hands or linking arms became a central symbol in the wampum making. Can you see that little tomahawk on the ground? We put the weapons of war aside and we're strengthening our relationship, those diagonal bars. Cherokees also had wampum used in the Southeast. Now, these were wampum belts that were actually given to them by the Haudenosaunee in the 18th century. You see this one covenant chain. It's got some initials in it, AM, two figures holding hands together. Kind of the checkerboard figures we see in the middle that to me represents some villages. The other one, the purple belt's interesting because we've got two tomahawks facing different directions and two figures at the other end. There's one belt that had these sticks woven into it. And there was one historical reference to that represents the nations that are joined together in unity on this particular agreement. Another way to show that is the belt on the bottom. The white belt means a peace agreement was made between three central nations or communities. These belts are held pretty secretly among the Cherokee today in Oklahoma. And I understand they bring them out maybe once a year to recite their message. But now there's a kind of a new spiritual message been attached to them, part of a new revitalization movement that took place in the late 1800s. Wampum kind of does that. Sometimes there's an original message, another message added to it, a third message, and then generations later, somebody picks that belt up and gives it new meaning. So think of it like a tape recorder. You record over something that was there before. Technically, it's still there, but there's over recording. The same thing with wampum belts. 1775, there's a great peace treaty made in Fort Pitt. During the American Revolutionary War, both the British and the Americans wanted the Haudenosaunee to remain neutral. So they had like competing council meetings. We made an agreement at Fort Pitt that we were going to be at peace with that we would not interfere into the war. So this belt was given by the Americans to the Haudenosaunee at that meeting. So again, I think those checkerboard diamonds represent the nations that are joined together in unity. You can't always read things literally because sometimes they use what belt they had at the time. So we don't know for sure, but if it was those nations that would represent the Six Nations, the Delaware and the Shawnee communities that were in alliance with the Americans. I found this interesting because Oneida made a declaration to the US. Possess your minds in peace, respecting us Indians. We cannot intermeddle in this dispute between two brothers. It's very important because we saw the British from overseas and the colonists as brothers to one another. We didn't want to quarrel. It seems to be unnatural. It was that we are one blood and we kind of love both of you. So we're not willing to join either side. This was the declaration they made. Unfortunately, some Oneidas broke this declaration and sided with the Americans, along with some of my relatives, the Tuscaroras, and some of the Mohawks, the Senecas, the Cayugas sided with the Crown, calling upon that old covenant treaty, and we kind of broke into two. And even though we were all for peace, we got dragged into the fight. So at one point, Joseph Brant stands up. He's holding this wampum belt. Two paths. So very much like the two-row, but now notice these paths are further apart. And basically what Joseph Brant said, pick the path you're going to follow. One will lead to Philadelphia and the American colonists. The other will lead overseas to the Crown, our ancient ally. He says, we can't sit still in this fight. You have to choose sides. So Joseph Brant helped to break the neutrality the Confederacy was trying to promote. But the chiefs couldn't make up their mind. They couldn't make that decision, just like the Oneida Declaration. So here's what they did. There was this one wampum belt that showed the unity of the Six Nations at that time. White belt represents peace. So digitally, I kind of rewove it back together. You can see those six crosses representing the Six Nations, those big diagonal rafters, but they cut the belt in half. They said, those that are going to Canada, you take half the belt with you. Those that staying in New York will keep one half belt. Then see where that missing thing is? They said there was a symbol of unity. I've been trying to figure out what that might have been. A small diamond? Anyway, they cut that out of the belt. Now, it's amazing, knowing the importance of wampum belts, that they would even consider cutting a belt, but that shows you the seriousness of the event. So we had a covenant chain with the United States through George Washington. He commissioned Oneida women to make this belt, I think in the 1790s, showing the 13 early colonies joined together around the house, around our law, in alliance with each other. There was a treaty signed in 1794 in Canandaigua, New York, where the U.S. committed to protecting our interests. So the treaty is the written document. It's the wampum belt. It's the treaty minutes. It's really about the relationship, not any particular document or moment in time. But our people ended up fighting against each other, and it was a bloody fight. And once we spilled blood on the ground, we kind of betrayed the intent of the Great Law of Peace. So we had to recover our sanity. This wampum belt that was held by the Oneidas for many years talks about the reunification of the Haudenosaunee after the American Revolutionary War. So now we can see the chain. Can you see the chain design there? And then the checkered diamonds representing the Six Nations. So this was at some special occasion where there was a meeting to recover our unity, and they wove this belt to commemorate that. This belt is still in the Field Museum in Chicago because there's 3 different Oneida groups. and they're all kind of contesting as to where the belt should go. So the museum won't return the belt until all the Oneidas can come together and make up their mind where it should go. During the War of 1812, Red Jacket, who was kind of a notorious character in our history, but he had seen a lot in the Revolutionary War, and he sent this wampum belt over to the chiefs at Grand River. Now, Red Jacket was living where, like Buffalo is today, Buffalo, there was Buffalo Creek Reservation. And he was basically pleading with them. I hope you will not go and make your children poor by joining the British government in case a dispute happens, as the War of 1812 was on the horizon. If you do, he says, the Americans said you're going to lose all your land. It'll be taken from you. It's the wisest thing you could do to remain neutral, because the king won't keep his promises to you. He failed to keep his promises during the American Revolutionary War, and he did not fulfill his engagements to Captain Brant. So he made a very strong appeal. Let's not fight in this war. But the chiefs at Grand River, probably because they were stinging from their loss of the Revolutionary War, 1776, they rejected Red Jacket. They still have this wampum belt today, but they didn't. And that's, in the old days, if they had agreed with it, they would have sent the belt back to Red Jacket and said, yes, okay, we agree with you, our brother. But they kept it. They couldn't agree. After the War of 1812, peace was made between the British and between the Great Britain and the United States. The British offered this belt. This was the last belt I mentioned that came to our people. And it's called the Pledge of the Crown belt, because they said that they're not going to interfere in our customs or traditions. They asked the Haudenosaunee to take this belt to all of the communities in alliance with the Crown. And that's what we did after that war. Just a few more to kind of wrap things up here. John Brant, who's Joseph Brant's youngest son, in 1830, he actually became the first Indigenous person to be elected to office in Upper Canada. He was also installed as a traditional chief. But the other chiefs got worried about this, because remember that ship in the canoe? Oh, you're a chief in the canoe, now you're an elected official in the ship. So they sent Brant this belt, kind of warning him, remember where you come from. This is very similar to a belt that represents a treaty between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, but that belt is a lot smaller than this one. So that's interesting how they use it. Now, what was the original intent of this belt? It's hard to say, but they used it in 1830 that way. Unfortunately, Brant died a couple years after that of cholera. He never got to take his elected seat because they said he was illegally elected because he wasn't a citizen, and that the people voted for him were not citizens. So, like I said, Red Jacket's kind of notorious in our communities, but he said this one time I thought was very interesting. Basically, he said, watch out for those tricky words that are attached to treaties. He says they don't believe them. They're not going to fulfill their promise. We never get the things they're talking about. He says our kettles are worn out, our claws turning to rags, and even the cows won't give milk. He says our jewelry has turned green. You know what that's like, right? It turns green when you don't polish it. When the last slab of bacon is gone, we won't have anything left. All of our land will be gone. So despite the treaties, despite wampums, the colonists and the settlers did things to help take away our land. So like I mentioned, we spent a lot of time recovering wampum belts. This was when the belts first returned back to Grand River. You can see many of those belts I just talked about. This is one of our chiefs at the time and the director of the Museum of the American Indian in New York City. It took years to negotiate this. And finally we did, and was quite successful in bringing them back. So I've learned the story of these belts basically from doing the research around that. Why do we need these belts? What do they mean to our ancestors? What they could mean to us? And now we use our wampum today to go around to our communities to recite its message. So here's our leaders holding the actual wampum belts that go right back to the Great Law. There's that circle wampum. There's those big mats that I showed you. There's the cane with the strings of condolence on there. There's another condolence cane held up. Those are replicas of wampum belts in the background. But for the last 7 years before COVID hit, we were going from each of our communities to recite the Great Law of Peace, as told to us now by our wampums, because this is the first time those wampums came back together in one collection in our hands, and the first time that most of our people got a chance to see them. So that gives you an idea of the significance of wampum and why I've spent a lot of time to recover them along, a lot of other people involved in that. But that's been my on-the-job training. Learn about them, learn their history, try to help capture the story, talk to old people who still had a memory of them, put that all together, and then pass it on to the next generation. So those are the kind of things I want to share with you this evening, to talk about why wampum is important in the development of Canada, why it's important to our people today, and hopefully why our oral history is equally important as the written history. So I encourage you to get together with old people, start telling the stories in your community. Find out what the old people know. What did your ancestors know, and keep telling that to yourselves among your people. Because if you don't, it's going to disappear. And at the same time, our generation has to add to those stories. What has it meant for us to have lost our land or lost our language, or what does it mean? And then add to that, what does it mean to have been able to keep the ceremonies going, to keep our language, to keep our songs, to keep our land? All of those stories become important, so that 50 years from now, when young people are sitting around a digital campfire like you are tonight, they're going to hear, this is how things happen. This is what it means. And this is your role to keep the good things going. So that's a few ideas I want to share with you this evening. I don't know if there's any other questions. I'd be glad to take a look at some of that. And we still have a few more minutes before we conclude tonight. So let's see what else we have.
Good, Rick. We've got a few more questions here.
All right.
One question is, are there any other colors besides white and purple that held large significance?
Well, sometimes red was attached to the belts, but also there's even some reference to green, being painted green. There's also glass wampum, meaning tubular beads are made out of glass. Those are used to make belts that were used for diplomatic purposes. Those could be real dark blue, purplish, even red glass. And so each community would have a different color matrix of meaning to that. But when it comes to shell wampum, there's only two colors, right? White or cream color and purple. So it was more of a question of weaving those designs together. And like I said, the hard part, it's not like once you learn one symbol that applies to all the belts with that same symbol. Sometimes the belt, sometimes its story does not seem to relate directly to the symbols on the belt. So that's kind of the mystery of wampum. All the more reason why I think you got to get close to it, find a way for it to tell you its story. And then when the wampum speaks, you better believe it, because it's been holding that story for a long time.
We have another question here about the symbol size and placement. So you mentioned earlier that often the belts were commissioned. This question is asking about sort of the design of the belt and whether it was a collaborative process involving many people. Yeah.
Well, this is what I imagine, because again, we don't have the record intact. The peacemaker and Hiawatha envisioned what these belts should look like because of the message there. But then they told, okay, go make something like that. And then once people see it and start using it, then it becomes like intuitive. You're going to make another belt that talks about this. Well, then you kind of use the same formula. So you could see the original belt, remember with the tree and the square nation, as a chain. There's the original chain that gets translated into others, covenant chain, other ideas of chainness, series of squares or diamonds or hexagons. So I think it becomes that way. When it comes time to make a new agreement, you have a registry of wampum designs, wampum belts, meaning. It's a lot easier then to say, okay, if this what this is about, we're going to take one from column A, one from column B, and we're going to weave this belt back together. Now there are some belts of very unique designs, but a lot of them will have diagonal bars, vertical bars, squares, hexagons, diamonds, and then the human figures, and then like the dog or the wolf. And remember the ones with the houses on them? We see them over and over again. So chances are, this is the artist in me talking. They would come to an agreement. This is what the agreement says. They would appoint somebody to weave a belt that codifies that agreement. Use your collective imagination, use your wampum imagination. You'd make this belt and then you'd put that forward. Some designs themselves would be kind of magical. That it would have the power of its meaning. So like there's the one belt I didn't show you, there's 6 figures with their arms joined together. Nothing represents unity stronger than that. People's holding hands with their arms joined together. So that becomes a reoccurring symbol in wampum belts through time. After this, think about that. If we were to make an agreement with Canada, what would the wampum belt look like that would codify that agreement from your point of view? If we were to make a wampum belt about residential schools and what happened, including this resolution, what would that look like? What would a Truth and Reconciliation wampum belt look like? What would a wampum belt look like at the UN, at the Universal Declaration of Indigenous Rights? So somebody may come up with a great design and everybody else, once they see it, said, oh yeah, do that. That works really well. Other times you might make a design and it takes a while for people to get into it, and finally then it becomes common language. So I think it's probably all of the above: individual creativity, group effort, and then some mentoring going on from old wampum memory to today.
Awesome. We have a question here from Illy Roldenstack, who asks, it seems the wampum you've spoken about describe historical treaties, agreement, and conflict. Are there wampum belts that tell other stories, like stories of creation or other teachings?
There are wampum strings as well as wampum belts, and sometimes the strings do that a little bit more. They carry a ceremonial function or flow. But I've often asked that myself too. Where's all the good tidings? You know, where's the wampum teaching that talks of, except for the dish with one spoon, which you could say is really about our cultural ecology. You're right. Most of the belts talk about we've arrived at this historic moment, and we want to capture the essence of that moment, either because of conflict or resolution. We record the conflict because we want to learn from that. Don't ever do this again, just like that missionary priest. But there's other times you could say, like the George Washington Covenant Belt, which was an ingenious way in which the United States reflected back to us our own tradition of unity, peace, all gathered around the Longhouse. Now, whether they meant it or not is a whole nother question. But that wampum symbol is a very powerful way, and our ancestors gravitated to it. If you can't see it, it's hard to comprehend. But if you don't know it and feel it, no matter what the wampum symbol is, it won't have the same value. Does that make sense? In other words, it's got to have some substance to it. So maybe that's why there were hundreds of belts, because there are many occasions in which the substance changed or altered or was amended or added to. So we have many variations of these wampum designs.
Absolutely. Great. We have a question here about, there's so many questions that are coming out, it's great. We have a question about the belt that's behind you from Teresa Peplinski. And she said it was pictured in the last photo in the presentation. So it's right underneath your Every Child Matters flag.
Oh yeah, well that is our Haudenosaunee flag, which was mimicked after that Confederacy wampum belt, the one that I showed you towards the beginning of the presentation with the tree in the middle. So that represents the original founding nations, the Senecas, Cayugas, Onondagas at the tree, the Oneidas, and then the Mohawks, with the path of peace running off. I'm a Tuscarora. We joined that confederation in the early 1700s. Although we kind of asked, so where are we in that wampum belt? So remember that one where I showed after the Revolutionary War? So finally there's this recognition of the Six Nations in squares united together in the path of peace. So that central path, that white line that connects all of those, that's an important metaphor for peace. We've united our hearts and minds together to live as one people. And that's when we began to call ourselves Haudenosaunee, people who build longhouses.
Awesome. We have a question here from Peyton H. asking, do Indigenous communities still make wampum belts?
Well, they're beginning to. I see there was several new belts that have been made by more like individual artists using the wampum to help reflect on important community matters. So wampum hasn't come to an end, that's for sure. And it's being used now to represent a new set of pictographs or imagery that talks about either holding on to tradition or dealing with colonization, or also sometimes projecting an ideal future. Wampum is about that. It's forward looking to carry the significance of that event forward. So, and there's a lot of wampum belts, like I said, we haven't been able to interpret, but I see that a lot. There's a lot of cultural records reaffirming what took place, what happened among our people, as well as what the future might look like.
McKinley has asked whether greater detail in belts generally indicates something. Is it, if a belt has more detail than another, does that tell you something?
Well, it says the wampum belt maker had more time on their hands. And through time, the design certainly got more elaborate, because you got to remember, a lot of times the French and the English, they're trying to impress us. So the fancier they'd make a belt, the more elaborate they would make the design, the more impressive looking it could be. But I would rather have them keep their word in a simple belt than make an elaborate belt full of deception. So it's hard to say. Today, the belts that are being made are very ornate and very intricate, and the designs are sometimes very complex. And let's just say whatever the need was. So that big belt that George Washington had committed, that's the largest wampum belt that we have. It's over 6 feet long. Like all things American, the bigger the better, you know. So I think he was trying to do that. I'm going to make the biggest belt because you know, I'm the great man. But so we see some of that. But like the Truro, it's profound in its simplicity. It shows you very graphically, this is what it's about. And sometimes I appreciate that better, because it's simple to comprehend.
Yeah. We have applause in the chat. Quinn McKinney asks us, is isotopic dating ever used to help determine when the belts were created or where they were created?
It's very difficult because it's hard to do the carbon dating on the shell itself, since it's, and the only way they've been able to do that if they find beads in situation to other objects, that maybe they can date those other objects. It gives them a relative date on that. Some beads were found in graves, in sites. Now, archaeologists will argue you can't find a tubular wampum bead, like the kind that all of these belts are made from, earlier than about 1500 AD. So in their mind, wampum is a relatively new invention. And then because of the European tools, it was a collaborative invention. But our oral history talks about it going back a lot further. And certainly there were ancient use of shell. So And some of the beads have been x-rayed so they can tell an earlier bead, you can see it was drilled from both ends. Later beads are drilled just through a single way. It's very small. But those are, how do you want to say it, minor facts. So I tend to say, doesn't matter when that bead was made or when that belt was woven, it's the content of the message that it contains. And our ancestors would continue to reweave these, maybe even put other substitute beads in there. Beads fall off, they get lost, they get broken, because they want the memory to continue.
Awesome. I do see that we had Tesco Chiganti raise their hand. They typed in the chat, but Emily, maybe you might be able to help me with the tech here in case Tesco wants to ask in person.
Sure, so I'll just allow it here.
And Tesco, you can just let us know if you just prefer us to read it, but you're welcome to ask in person. And while that's being arranged, I just want to highlight that grandmother Marilyn Capriol is here with us, and she just joined us partway through the meeting. I just wanted to highlight that and say hi, Marilyn, and also, you know, if you have any questions as well, you're welcome to raise them. I see Tesco has asked for me to read the message, and so Tesco's question was, how many wampum belts do you think were ever made?
Well, I did an unofficial tally. I just every time I come across a record of one, you know, I started numbering them. But when I got over 3,000, I just kind of gave up because there's just so many. And sometimes belts, again, are used different ways. The Jesuits talk about these meetings where sometimes 30 wampum belts are delivered at a time. And sometimes the belts are very small, sometimes they're very big. So it's really hard to say. But let's just say hundreds and hundreds of thousands of wampum beads were known to have been made and traded. And if you look at the Dutch colonial records, the English colonial records, the wampum was the big thing, producing wampum for trade as well as these diplomatic efforts. And then they start scrambling in the late 1700s, early 1800s. They're scrambling to find wampum beads because they're becoming rarer and rarer. There was actually a wampum bead making kind of factory operations going on along the East Coast. But by time governments start looking west, they began to think more of wampum as a trade item rather than a diplomatic item. So the wampum has a very interesting history in itself.
Thank you. And it looks like those are all the questions that we have in the chat, other than any, Marilyn, from Martina to you. Yeah.
Well, that's good because I got to get back to bed checking the old folks home. So I appreciate you spending some time with me this evening. And I hope this has been helpful to get you to understand the important nature of wampum. And please share with people now that you've shared some of these ideas and learned that, get the conversation going. And I appreciate you all taking the time to be with us this evening. I'd like to thank our hosts for the great job that they did. And I'd like to say, Yahweh, thank you to all of you for being with us this evening.
Yahweh, Rick, we've got lots of thank yous coming through on the chat.
Yahweh, Rick.
Miigwech, Yako.
Yep. I really don't have to make it back for bed check, but
I did take that quite seriously. Oh, we better let you go.
don't want to be recorded as being late.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we've got excellent timing here. It's 9 on the dot.
Okay, so I'll see you all again somewhere down the road, and thank you very much.
Umapi, Rick.
Mapi, Rick.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for Rick's talk. I personally learned a lot, and I hope that you all did as well, and that you're able to carry some of this with you going forward. Yeah, and that you all have a wonderful night. And until we're able to meet again, Bamapi, we'll see you soon.
Bamapi.